Hello friends, this is part 4 of the series, the book called The Crack Mirror. Space as culturally constructed phenomena. As mentioned above, for Lebre and Foucault, experiential space is culturalized phenomena. It is primarily about controlling people in finite, enclosed, and divided sites. I have argued here that it is this conception of space that has epistemological implication for the emergence of social thought in early 20th century India. Taking a cue from Lebre, I further argue that space is experiential in its depth when understood in its cultural manifestation. Space is culturally constructed phenomena. Structuring and restructuring of a given space is the result of specific action carried out by a historically dominant social group which achieves its hegemonic purpose through a regulated exercise of civilized violence against those social groups that are victims of this kind of violence. Violence in general would seek to restructure space in a specific way, particularly, for example, construct patriarchy, for example, construct public and private spaces in specific way, assigning a little domain of sovereignty to women. Women thus are restricted to enjoy their sovereign power only over the kitchen. In this regard, scholars often quote Tagore's Ghare Wahi Re. The confinement to the private domain indicate indirect way of inflicting violence on women through intimidation. Interestingly, patriarchy deploy its ideology to neutralize the impact of this violence. Yet, I argue these forms do not complete the definition of civilization violence. Caste-based violence is primarily linked up with the struggle to liberate the rigid spaces through transgression of boundaries. One could cite umpteen cases from the social history of India to prove this point. The most recent example that one could mention is the transgression of hierarchical boundaries by Dalit in the village called Khairlanji in the Vidarbha region of Maharashtra. But the Dalits had to pay a heavy price for this transgression as four Dalits from the same family were killed by the middle caste from this village. The members from the middle caste did not like the Dalits violating the social protocol that were arbitrarily decided by the former for maintaining their social dominance in the village. What defines violence is the simultaneity of both the presence and absence of the victim of violence. Physical violence leading to the annihilation of a corporeal being fulfill half the condition of the definition of civilization violence. The elimination of certain groups like the untouchables from social and culturally active relations ironically provide the full definitional condition of civilizational violence. Let me explain this by drawing on Ambedkar's social understanding of the historical evolution of untouchables in India. Ambedkar developed the theory of broken men in order to understand how a particular restructuring of social spaces has pushed a large section of the population beyond the pale of human interaction. Ambedkar argued that all human beings basically dwell in the dense of forest and hilly habitats. It is only through their settlement on the plains that they were fragmented into several caste groups, tightly organized around the ideology of purity and pollution. The discovery of agriculture on the plains led to the production of surplus grain. The surplus and control over it in turn led to its appropriation by few who had to defend the surplus either through physical force or by the force of an ideology. As Ambedkar suggests, the Twice-Born used Brahminical ideology to create the category of untouchable and later used them as a shock absorber to defend the surplus from being plundered or destroyed by the barbarians. As a part of the ideology of purity pollution, the untouchables were pushed outside the main village. Ambedkar calls them broken men. Ambedkar's understanding of broken man gives us a clue to the argument that the village system based on rigidly hierarchized social morphology came into being along with the emergence of social surplus in grains. Broken men were pushed outside the main village and those who were more militant were pushed further into forest. Those who stay close but not too close to the functioning village were required to protect the main village from intruder by first warning the people about impending danger and then by physically protecting the main village both from the wild animal and barbarians. Thus, the social and cultural distance was maintained through working out an elaborate ideology that was developed over time to time. The untouchables were required to enter the village only during a specific period of time. Most of the time, they were supposed to remain in their dark hole, their little ghettos, and ultimately remain untouchable, uncrossable, unseeable, unhearable, seeing and sensing human being and offering appreciation for their creation also form a part of civilization. And unapproachable and uncommunicable language provides the main energy for the continuation of any civilization. They had to be all these almost all the time to at least the top rung of the twice born who were to use Plato's term the philosopher king of India. What was just for the untouchable to use the Platonic and Aristotelian ideas of justice was to remain confined to their black hole and their only jobs was to provide free service to the twice born caste in the main village by producing for the latter along with the other services caste. As seen before, in addition to the production of grain, the untouchables also protected the top rung of the twice born from external enemies. To put it more sharply, the untouchables perform the job of shock absorber in order to protect the top rung of the twice born, who were so completely self absorbing in the Aristotelian sense of the term. This confinement into dark hole was fully demonstrated by the Peshwa rule in 18th and 19th century Pune in Maharashtra, as has been well documented by several scholars. The untouchable were pushed outside time and space, or they were relegated to the fragmented time and space through restricting their movement across social space by using rigid ideological lines. During Peshwa rule in 19th century Pune, Orthodox Brahmin rule in Pune imposed severe social restriction on the untouchables, thus rendering them socio-culturally disabled in terms of normal interaction among several social groups. Thus, untouchables were restricted to walk in the street of Pune only during moon and night time, but not in the morning or in the afternoon. This was because it was not only their touch or sight that was considered polluting, even their shadow was considered to be a source of defilement for the upper caste. Needless to say, in 19th century, the untouchable were erased from the human interaction. This civilizational annihilation enacted through the shadow of untouchables in effect removed the possibility of a human being touching another being or being touched in turn by others. Thus, the idea of the shadow as an effective means of protection from ritual pollution required time and physical space as a precondition for its articulation. The shadow of an untouchable itself become not an empty but a powerful space that can conversely regulate the movement of upper caste body. The shadow then becomes a boomerang for the upper caste Brahmin. The shadow in another context play an important role in defining the notion of authenticity and dignity or self-respect. Those who prefer to walk in the shadow of somebody do not find it necessary to discover themselves outside the shadow. The idea of the shadow is very interesting and require a detailed treatment, but I do not intend to pursue it here except to mention that the shadow provides, at least at a discursive level an opportunity for people to feel epistemologically superior. For example, political thinker in modern India such as Bhudev Mukhopadhyay felt epistemologically superior in what they thought was the dark epistemological shadow of Western thought. Conversely, as Uday Mehta has pointed out in his work, the Western thinker also used Indian thought as the dark epistemological shadow to derive the satisfaction that their thought was on the right track and perhaps better than Indian. The shadow in metaphysical sense acquire a negative power, almost like the ghost or voodoo magic that is used to keep oneself or the entire village free from evil forces. In the context of 19th century Pune, one could conclude that in the reciprocal act of mutual constraint, the Brahmins force the untouchable to tie an earthen pot around their neck and a broom around their waist. The pot was to spit in, and the broom was to erase their full footprint that were also considered polluting. It is quite ironic to notice that Brahmin all over the country follow the footprint of British thinkers, but within the local configuration of power, they force the untouchable to erase the footprints. They did try to erase the philosophical footprints of Ambedkar too. Thus, the Peshwa rules seems to have developed the prototype of today's biometric technique, which the state has developed for greater extensive surveillance of its population. During the Peshwa rule, the notion of space compounded the sense of humiliation of the untouchable, first by seeking the confinement of the latter in a social space, and later by rendering the bodies legible through grafting cultural symbols on these bodies. Thus, bodies are turned into cultural space that the Brahminical system could rule over, could write on, and could regulate this rule. The Peshwa rule in 19th century Pune followed the same path that the colonial state adopted for the upper caste Indian. The Brahminical rule not only controlled the social space but also turned the untouchable body into cultural space that push the untouchable into shadow during daytime. Ambedkar therefore argued that the untouchable were treated like Hyans who like untouchables are Nishachar who come out into the open from their den only during the night time. In terms of time, the untouchable could become sovereign during the night as the Veskar, the village watchman. In terms of space, they could also become sovereign when they were within the confine of their dark hole, Hulgari or Cheri, Mahar, Mangwada or Chamar Tola. Thus, village India entailed the division of two mutually connected and yet culturally exclusive social spaces: Agrahara, the Puritan inner, and the Cheri, the untouchable ghetto, the impure exterior. This dynamic between the universal sovereign Agrahara and the particular sovereign Dalitwadas in is very effectively brought out by Baby Kamble in her own autobiography. Kamble's autobiography suggests that the ideological division of space into sacred, agrahara, and profane untouchables ghetto was created and regulated over the body of her father. Her father's body defined two mutually exclusive spheres of sovereignty, the agrahara and the Dalit ghetto, as mentioned above. Whenever he was walking in the main village, he would walk with the hunchback, eyes cast downward. This body language certainly endorsed the universal notion of sovereignty as enjoyed by dominant caste within the village context. He had speech power, but that was radically replaced by the noise of the bells that were tied to the top of the stick that the Mahar were supposed to carry with them whenever they were in the service of the village. The noise of the bell could communicate the undesirable arrival of untouchable in the main village. Thus, the speech act with words get replaced with sign language. Whenever her father finished his job and entered the Dalit ghetto, his body language would radically change, thus making his body flexible with a straight neck, chest balloon, and eyes cast toward the sky. This body language would suggest that he enjoys sovereignty over the ghetto. Within this sphere of sovereignty, he would not only enjoy his freedom but also superior status over his fellow untouchables. This body language achieved the perfect definition of servile who is too ready to obey the master and too quick to run down his own constituency. Ambedkar struggled to annihilate these two spheres of sovereignty and to render Dalit rights universal was linked with the social movement and aim at transgress the sacred spaces. The predicament of Kamle's father thus suggests a complex relationship of space to subjectivity. The untouchable were caught up in their own subjectification as they responded to the social relationship that had constraining impact on their subjectivity. If this was the nature of Indian civilization, which under the logic of local configuration of power reduce a large section of people to the level of hyenas, then it become imperative on the part of the post-colonial theories to give up their one-sided reading of civilizational violence and take a historicized or Samayak view that will make them accept what Walter Benjamin had to say about civilization, that every document of civilization is book on barbarism. Will cover in next part.